Thanks a lot. Hi, Ben. Hello. How's everyone doing? Good. So I'm talking about the evolution of cryptocurrencies because I think we're just getting started, essentially. So I'm kind of curious, how long have you been in Bitcoin? So let's say, who was into Bitcoin 5 years ago? So 2000, what is that? I can't do the math. I went to government school. 2012? So just a couple, about 3 years ago. About 10, 1 year ago. About 20. Anyone just brand new to it? 1, 2, 3. So some brand new. Cool. Well, I've been around here in this Bitcoin space since 2011, so 6 years, around when it was around $3. And I was basically saying the exact same things I'm saying right now, and I will say the exact same things. Even when it was at $3, I'm saying the same things now with it close to $6,000. But before we get into why I think this is just the beginning, let's talk about how we got here and why this is so important. A lot of people don't understand exactly why this is important. There's still a lot of people who just think this is just some funny computer money. There's even people, completely ignorant people, who think it's like Beanie Babies. I don't want to mention too many names, Peter Schill. And of course, we've had all these people coming out just lately. This is part of the reason you know that this is starting to take off, because the actual criminals are all coming out and attacking it now. So all the politicians, the central bankers, the crony capitalists, even just yesterday, Warren Buffett came out again against Bitcoin. He said in 2014 or 15 that Bitcoin is a mirage. And now that it's at $6,000 and actually a total valuation of even more than his net worth of about 100 billion, he's apparently worth about 80 billion. He says it's a bubble. So it turned from a mirage into a bubble, and they're all coming out and attacking it now, and I'll get into why they're doing that. But before we get into that, let's talk about money. Let's talk about banking. Where did this all come from? Many people know, but some people don't, because they don't teach it in the government indoctrination camps that you're forced to go to for 12 years, about money. And they do that on purpose. It was actually Henry Ford, way back, like over 100 years ago, who said if people understood how the money system works, there'd be a revolution tomorrow. And it's actually true, if they actually understood it, and that's why they never want anyone to understand what money is. Interestingly enough, even people who look quite smart don't understand money at all. People like Warren Buffett. He has no understanding of what money is, which is quite interesting because his father really understood it. His father was a major gold bug. His father hung out with people like Murray Rothbard. So he had the people around him when he was younger to get this information, but he didn't like it. He wanted the fiat system, the crony capitalist system, the central banking communist style system, central planning. And he's taken a lot of advantage of that, and he definitely has, obviously. And still to this day, he takes a lot of advantage of it. Most of the real money that Warren Buffett makes today is doing crony capitalist type deals with people like Goldman Sachs, buying things like government bonds at discounts and things like that. Total fascism, total crony capitalism. Nothing to do with free markets. But let's talk about what is the banking system, what is money. It was really 1913 when everything in the US, or the USSA as I call it, changed. That's on December 23rd, 1913, was the founding of the Federal Reserve in Congress. Con as in not progress, Congress. Con as in con men, confidence game. Congress, I think they do this on purpose. The definition in the dictionary of Congress, one of them is something like a group of baboons. Isn't that right? People know this? Is it monkeys or baboons or something? So when you see a bunch of baboons, that's called a Congress. They slide these things in just to let people know. It's like all hidden information, that they do this on purpose. This whole system's been set up. It's all incredibly illegitimate. It's all criminal. It's a big Ponzi scheme. And we're not talking about government, talking about central banks. But it was really in 1913 that they got together in a place called Jekyll Island, And this is where the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin came from. It was people like J.P. Morgan and all kinds of criminals, all the top sort of criminals got together, and they decided they wanted to take over the government of the U.S., and they did. And it was even, I think, the president back then, wasn't it Woodrow Wilson? Is that right? Yeah. Who came out and said afterwards, but no one seemed to really notice, that he felt really bad. He just basically sold the government to these guys. And no one seemed to notice. No one seems to care. Of course, they got all the people in government indoctrination camps, and then they go home and watch their television programming. It's called programming for a reason. So your average person is just completely has no idea what's going on. I was even walking around today, downtown Austin, and half the people were dressed up in zombie costumes. And I was like, you don't have to dress up. You're zombies every day. It's totally true. They're just walking around, football, beer. Oh, got to support the flag. So yeah, it was sold out. And that was actually the third central bank of the U.S. Not a lot of people know this because, again, they don't teach this stuff in any schools. It was the third central bank of the U.S. They've been trying to get it in since the very beginning with some of the founding fathers, which I find incredibly cultish sounding. And the fact that people out there call them, that's my founding fathers. It's like being in North Korea. It's like the exact same way they talk about Lil Kim in North Korea is, you know, they glorify them. Oh, that's all programming. Even the U.S. itself was not a free country, even at the very, very, very beginning. It was a takeover by a bunch of guys, and some of the guys were pretty cool, I have to admit. They were really smart. People like Thomas Jefferson understood a lot about liberty and all that kind of stuff. But then they had slaves, and then they, all men created equal except for basically women and non-white people, basically. All this stuff has been forgotten. But it essentially was a sort of a takeover. It wasn't this big liberty revolution. It was just sort of your average statist government takeover. And interestingly enough, it was all over a 2% tax on tea, which is interesting, because now no one seems to mind that there's like a 50% tax on everything. And they're all fine with it. And they even get mad when the football, the players who play the ball games, if they don't stand up for the government's national sing-along, people get really angry. That's how indoctrinated and brainwashed most people are. But essentially, that was taken over in 1913. And everything changed on that day. And I don't think it's a coincidence that World War I started the next year in 1914. Oh, and I should point out, it was also 1913, two incredibly evil things happened. The founding of the Federal Reserve, which was unconstitutional. Not that the Constitution matters all that much. Just a piece of paper. But a lot of people seem to think it's kind of important. But anyway, we can all agree it doesn't really exist anymore. It's a piece of paper in a museum. Has nothing to do with anything that's going on in the U.S. today. But two things happened in 1913, and this was not by accident at all, because they come hand in hand. They put in the central bank, and they put in, for the first time ever in the U.S., an income tax. Both in the same year. And I don't think it's any coincidence that 1 year later, World War I started. And I don't know about you guys, but whenever I hear about World War I, everyone's like, yeah, it was so weird. Just happened out of nowhere, this guy got killed that no one even knew who he was. And then all of a sudden, tens of millions of people are dead. It's all planned and staged by the same people who control the central banks. And when we talk about who controls the central banks, the Rothschild family is a big part of it. So they came in, and it was even Ron Paul who said that it's no coincidence that the 20th century, the century of total war, which really it was a century of central banking. You can't have these wars without central banking. Central banks pay for these wars, and actually they plan these wars. World War II is the same, all the wars. You can get into the false flag attack on 9/11 to start the war on terror, the war of terror. All these things are planned by the same general sort of people. So they started in 1913. It wasn't too long before they did their first sort of economic attack on the people in general, which was the 1929 Great Depression. Now, if you actually look into it, they increased the money supply dramatically, which they could for the first time because they had a central bank. before 1929, they took all the profits from that rise that came, which is always going to happen when you inflate the money supply. And they know this. The people who really, people like Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke, they're just puppets. Just the same way Barack Obama or George Bush or Donald Trump are all just puppets. They are not the real people who control anything. They are selected. They're not even elected. This whole thing is a big sham, a big show. But if you look back at what happened in the Great Depression, they increased the money supply. They knew exactly when they were going to decrease the money supply. And by the way, that exact same thing is happening right as we speak. I'll get into that. But they decreased the money supply dramatically. They sold everything. Everything crashed because that's exactly what's going to happen when you increase the money supply dramatically and you decrease it dramatically, everything's going to crash. That's just common knowledge if you understand money. And then they bought up everything at pennies on the dollar after that. And they've been doing this over and over and over. Every single boom and every single bust is generally planned and generally all caused by the central bank itself. The central bank that says one of its only main reasons to exist is to get rid of booms and busts, which actually didn't exist before the central bank. So it's a big scam. And then, of course, right after they did the big heist of the Great Depression, a few years later, they said, well, now we have to make gold illegal in the land of the free. In 1933, again, no one seemed to really notice too much. No one seemed to care. But yeah, in the land of the free, you couldn't even own gold for 40 years until the 1970s, when the next big event happened, which was all planned. And that was after spending tons of money and going really bankrupting the government, mostly on things like the Vietnam terrorist attack. They call it a war. They even had to fake the moon landings to get everyone's mind off of everything. Most people aren't aware of all this sort of stuff. This is just if you look into things, if you're awake. But they all planned this, and if you look at, it was August 15th, 1971. Richard Nixon, the great president Richard Nixon, who also started the war on drugs, which still to this day is ongoing and still ruining the lives of millions of people. So he was sort of like, just, you know, he was so bad. They're all bad, but he was there for the start of the war on drugs. And actually, I don't know if many people know this, the person he had as the sort of the front man, the public figure for the war on drugs was Elvis Presley. No one seems to notice, no one seems to care. But it was August 15th, 1971, Richard Nixon came out because what happened was there was still some gold backing of the dollar. Essentially, foreign governments and central banks could actually go directly to the US Treasury and say, okay, we've got 1 billion of these useless pieces of paper with dead criminals printed on them. We'd like something kind of a little bit better, like gold. And they used to allow them to exchange it for gold. So what happened is the US government was so bankrupt again in 1970s that France actually was one of the main countries who was trying to turn in their dollars for gold. And they realized if everyone does this, we're not going to have any gold. Not that there's any gold left in Fort Knox anyway. Whole other story, whole other lie. But they essentially said, okay, well, we're going to just have to remove the gold backing away from the dollar. And you can actually go on YouTube and look up Richard Nixon's television programming address to the nation about that. And the whole reason he said he did it was because of money speculators. Obviously another lie. They decided to do that because what they really wanted to do is remove any sort of gold backing away from the dollar, because that gives them free rein to spend as much money as they want. And what have we seen since then, right? The US government just going into more and more debt. Actually, every country in the world, because what happened after 1971, every country in the world essentially had a completely fiat currency. Fiat currency to me means that it's forced on you by the government. So here in the land of the free, you're forced to pay your extortion fees to the IRS in US dollars. They're not even called dollars, it's called Federal Reserve notes. They also have a pyramid with an all-seeing eye on the back of the $1 bill. I don't know if anyone notices these sort of things. But they removed the gold backing away from the dollar at that time. So every currency in the world essentially was free floating, not backed by anything. So what have we seen since then? We've seen every government in the world go into massive, massive amounts of debt, which is only possible because they can print up their own currency. Now, we've seen lots of them go under. We've seen lots of currencies hyperinflate into worthlessness. Just recently, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. Now, these countries are just a little faster at getting to the end point of all fiat currencies, which is zero. That is the end point when you have an unbacked currency that can be printed up at will by a central bank. So you have the US government and all governments in the world at this point without anything backing their currencies. Now, a lot of people say, what about the gold bugs back then in the 70s? People like, for example, Doug Casey and a few others who said this whole system is going to collapse. Well, my belief on it is the governments of the world did not have enough time to build up enough debt at that point in time for everything to collapse. So if you look at the debt numbers of governments in the 1970s, they were minuscule compared to today. You look at the US, and I'm just off the top of my head, I think it was around a few $100 billion. That's what the US government spends every month now, is a few hundred, actually more than a few $100 billion. They spend $400 billion a month. So it spends, the total debt of the US government in the 1970s is spent in about 2 weeks now. And when I say spent, I mean a lot of it's just printed up and goes into more debt for the US government. So it didn't fully collapse. In the late 70s, it came quite close to collapsing, but there wasn't enough debt. So what happened was the Federal Reserve person at the time, Paul Volcker, looked at it, apparently, who knows, and said, okay, this whole thing's going to collapse unless we allow interest rates to go to their natural level. And of course, that's one of the main things central banks do, is suppress interest rates. So he allowed, generally, the interest rate to the market to decide the interest rate. And what happened was, by the late 70s, the market decided that the interest rate should be about 18%. Now, that caused a major correction, you could call it depression, recession at the very least, which is quite normal, but it actually allowed the system to reset itself, because that's what you actually need, is the market to reset, for people to get wiped out in these sort of events and to reset it. And they actually allowed that to happen in the 70s. So we kind of had a second sort of reset at that moment in time in the 70s. Now, since then, though, it's just been more and more and more government debt across the world. And we're going to be reaching the actual end game of all of this very, very soon. You look at the US government, it just passed $20 trillion. Even under the great outsider, Donald Trump, they had some of their biggest deficits ever, since he's been the lead teleprompter speaker for the cabal. And it's not going down at all. And even if some people believed what he said before, which obviously they haven't been paying attention to politics to believe a politician, but he said, oh, we're going to reduce the debt and all this sort of stuff. It's actually not really possible at this moment in time. This system is so far beyond any sort of salvation. It has to collapse, is essentially what needs to happen. Something like the 1970s, but probably a lot worse. So you now have $20 trillion of US government debt, which is more than double of what the debt was when Nobel Peace Prize winner Barack Drone Bomber won the presidency in 2008 and didn't have one day of peace his entire presidency. When he came in, I believe the debt was around 8 trillion, maybe 9 trillion. So it's doubled since then. So it's doubled in just 8 years. That's Banana Republic complete, nearing hyperinflation, nearing collapse sort of numbers. And there's really no easy way out of this, and I've been saying this for years. This is what the Dollar Vigilante was founded upon in 2010, was, I said, within the decade probably, give or take a few years, but within the decade, so we still have a couple years left, the US dollar is going to collapse, and all fiat currencies are going to collapse. And if you actually look into, if you understand the occult and what they are actually really doing, they actually put on the front page of The Economist magazine, which is an actual Rothschild-owned magazine, and they put every year, if you don't know this, they say what they're going to do in cartoons. It's partly because they believe that they have to tell the people what they're going to do before they do it to them, and it removes some of the karma of all the evil stuff they do. In 1988, on the front page of The Economist magazine was a phoenix with a gold chain around his neck, which is interesting, with a coin on it, and it had the number 10. I'm not sure what that was about, although some people do speculate that's Bitcoin, 1-0 binary, right? But I don't think it was. I don't think Bitcoin was created by the government. But it is possible, but I don't think it was. But it said on there, it was a bunch of US dollars, Japanese yen, all kinds of currencies, all burning, and it said, 2018 new world currency. Now these people planned decades in advance. We know the euro, for example, the euro currency was planned decades in advance. It was in talks at Bilderberg, which is where a lot of the sort of more elite people go to work on their plans in secret. They talked about building the euro and the euro currency in the 50s. So they planned decades in advance. Now, I don't know if they're going to follow through in 2018 with a world currency, which would be a one world currency, which would likely be the SDR, or special drawings rights, of the IMF and things like the World Bank. But we are nearing the very end of this system. You have, as I mentioned, $20 trillion in debt, but that's not even scratching the surface. The US government hasn't actually been audited. This is in the actual auditing numbers. Every year they put out. The auditors go, we don't know. There's no way. It's a big mess when they try to audit the US government. And even in the US Department of Defense, stationed in the Pentagon, I don't know if anyone's noticed this, has, they lose trillions of dollars all the time. They lost $2.3 trillion. On September 10th, they announced it, 2001. Donald Rumsfeld, you can look this up on YouTube, came out and said, we just lost $2.3 trillion. Now, the lapdog mainstream media were all bought out and paid for, and mostly all CIA people. Didn't really have a lot to say about it, and if anyone did, it was probably like, trillion? Like, no one's even heard that amount of money. How do you lose $2.3 trillion? Well, it didn't matter, because the next day, the accounting department in the Pentagram blew up. It's apparently hit by a plane, but no cameras caught the plane hitting it in the most secure building in the world. Although it was released a few years ago, and I was actually in an airport. That's the only place I ever see fake news like CNN, which is one of the only things I agree with Donald Trump on. And I was at the airport, and I see CNN, and I was walking by, and they said, well, conspiracy theorists have been proved wrong again. I'm like, oh, what's going on? And they said, there's been a wild conspiracy that no plane hit the Pentagon on September 11, 2001. And so the Pentagram released today 3 frames of the plane hitting. And I was like, oh my God, maybe I was wrong. I could be wrong. I'm not saying I know everything, but I looked very suspicious at the very least. The most secure building in the world has no video. No one saw it. Well, a few people said they saw it, but they're all bought and paid for sort of people. But so I look at the screen and they go, 3 frames, here they are. First frame, nothing. It's just like birds chirping, sunny day. Second frame, some smoke, like little wispy smoke, like kind of like a missile really, but like it looked like a little bit of wispy smoke. And then a big explosion. It was the third frame. And I was looking at it, I was like, and then the announcer, who was like the television programmer, the brainwasher, the newsreader, came back on and went, well, case closed. There obviously was a plane that hit a Pentagon. And I was like looking at it like, I felt like surreal, like, is this even real? And I looked around and everyone was nodding. You see those crazy conspiracy theorists? Like I said, those people wearing zombie costumes, they might as well wear them all year long. What was I talking about before I got get me started on 9/11, I won't stop. Oh, the SDR, yeah, thank you. Someone's paying attention and taking notes. Probably CIA taking notes. Spotted. But yeah, they're bringing in the one world currency, and they want to. They want to bring, this is the New World Order agenda, and this is not a conspiracy theory. This is all fact. They've been talking about this. George Bush on the in his State of the Union address, the first George Bush, said, this is our New World Order. They've been talking about this for a while, and they want sort of a one world government. And the one world government will essentially be the United Nations and the one world currency. And so I think it's all been planned to do this for a long time. Now, I don't know if it's going to be in 2018. Wow, time flies when you start talking. But I don't know if it'll be in 2018, but it seems to be right on track. I didn't even get into the U.S. government debt too much. As I mentioned, $20 trillion, that's just scratching the surface. It's actually over $100 trillion in debt and liabilities the U.S. government has. Is that guy talking to me? I don't know what he's doing. Might be on some Adderall or something. Might be a lone wolf shooter here. Anyway, they have somewhere between $100 and $200 trillion in debt and liabilities. The liabilities are things like socialist insecurity, or as the people call it, social security. It adds up to well over $100 trillion. No one really knows because you can't account for any of these things, but it's a minimum, everyone agrees it's a minimum $100 trillion. So if you just do the math, if you have a calculator that does numbers that big, $100 trillion divided by 350 million people in the US, tax slaves, it works out to about $250,000 for every single man, woman, and child in the US of US government debt and liabilities overhanging it. So every single household that you see that has 4 people in it, family of 4, has $1 million in US government debt and liabilities overhanging it that they're supposed to pay off at some point through their extortion, through their taxes. Obviously that's impossible, especially with about half of Americans today living paycheck to paycheck. So this whole system has to collapse, and it will collapse. And it'll probably collapse exactly when they want it to, because a lot of these things are planned. And when it collapses, I think they want to bring in their one world currency. Now, how this happens is anyone's guess. But, man, I've been talking so much about the evil system. I haven't even talked about the awesome system, Bitcoin, yet. Here's why Bitcoin is so important. Because Bitcoin is the first real currency that is from the free market, that is not controlled by central banks or governments and can't be controlled by central banks or governments, which is the most important part, which actually gives you the power to have your own bank in your pocket. It was even Barack drone bomber who said just last year that Bitcoin is like having a Swiss bank account in your pocket. And he's right. It's actually way better than that. It's way better than a Swiss bank account in your pocket. And one of the things, and he said in the same speech, he said, if we're not able to crack this, how are we going to be able to do simple things like tax enforcement? Well, you're not, which is awesome. So we're reaching the end of this one system, and it's going to go down no matter what. They're going to try to replace it with their one world currency system, which actually will probably be digital, because they want to track everything. They want to get everyone into, they want to track every single transaction and tax it immediately as soon as it happens. Now, then there's Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, which are just as important, in my opinion, that make it far harder. Well, first of all, they can't control it. They can't inflate it. And that takes away most of their power right there. That is the key. We wouldn't have these big governments and these wars and all this debt and poverty without central banks. So a lot of people say, well, what if the government or the central banks take over Bitcoin? Well, first of all, they can't. But let's just say they did, and they had control of Bitcoin, whatever that means. But if they can't increase that limit of 21 million Bitcoins, then their powers that they have through money printing is gone. And so you would have every government in the world be bankrupt overnight because they can't print more money to keep going more and more into debt. So that we'd have much smaller governments that get rid of every war. There'd be no more wars without central banks. That's why Ron Paul said that quote about central banking and war. They wouldn't be able to do most of the things that they currently do if they were limited by a hard money supply. And that's why Bitcoin is so important. So I don't know how much time I have here. It looks like I'm half hour in, so.
Yeah, just leave a little time for questions if you want to take some.
Okay, would I have like 5 or 10 more minutes to talk about Bitcoin?
Yep.
Okay. So the reason this is so important, as you can see, is this is a battle for the future of how the world is going to be. What they want is just like on the back of the $1 bill with that pyramid with the all-seeing eye. They want all the control at the top, and they want everyone underneath it. Top-down control, central planning, sort of like communism. And they're actually all proponents of communism, all the people at that level. And it's not because they think communism is awesome. They think it's great because they can control everything and control all the people because of it. And impoverish all the people. As we know, communism just destroys economies. So we have this that's their vision. And it's sort of like the vision that both George Orwell and Aldous Huxley both wrote about at the same time. They both wrote about different angles they'll go, and I think they went to Oxford or something like that, but they were very connected to the globalist elitists, whatever you want to call them. There's all different names for them. They were very connected to them, and George Orwell wrote his book, 1984, which we're currently living in. And then Aldous Huxley and George Orwell's book was about complete tyrannical control of all the information, NSA, agents on everywhere, CIA. No real freedoms whatsoever, USSA. That was what his book was about. And then Aldous Huxley said, no, but the other thing they're going to do too is they're going to dumb the people down. Just walk around on the street out there. Give them all kinds of an entertainment to keep them occupied. Football games, nothing against sports, by the way. I'm a huge hockey fan. But it's all the whole Roman thing, bread and circuses. That's what they do, so they pump this stuff out. And that's, if you look at your average American's life, it's all about sports and American Idol, drinking beer, which is legal, which actually all things should be legal, obviously, but it's funny because one of the only things that is legal that you can take to kind of alter your state of mind is one of the worst drugs ever in history, alcohol. Actually, basically just dumbs you down, right? It makes it so you don't want to look into anything, whereas if you have some cannabis, for example, all of a sudden you sit down and you start thinking, you're like, yeah, man, we're all slaves, man. Right? So that's why that's taken quite a while. Now you even see Donald Trump attacking it, and he's got his Jeff Sessions criminal guy who's like, you're bad if you do this. It's because those things are kind of open your mind a little bit, whereas the alcohol doesn't. That's why they want everyone drinking the alcohol. Again, not that I don't mind having a drink every now and then, but that's why they promote these sort of things. So Aldous Huxley said that's what they're going to do. They're going to go out, they're going to give everyone pills. Now look what's going on in the U.S. I think it's over 20% of women in the U.S. are on some sort of antidepressant. These antidepressants, by the way, they turn you into psychopaths, essentially. Most of the shootings that you see on the television programming aren't what they say they are, but the ones that are real, like actually what they said they were, it's all people on these mind-altering antidepressants and things like that, which one of the things it says on all the antidepressants, side effect, suicidal tendencies. There's natural ways to, actually I was depressed. I didn't know it, and I got out of it just by changing my diet, exercising, spirituality, meditation, yoga, all that kind of stuff. All these things are natural. We were given all this stuff naturally, but they don't want you to know about any of this kind of stuff. So that's what the plan was on their side. The evolution, I don't call it revolution because revolution is to go back, right? It's completing a circle. We're not going back anywhere with things like Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. This is a brand new, freedom-enabling, power to the people, not just even money. It's changing everything. It started with Bitcoin, blockchain, and that's changing money and banking. That's why we're seeing all these people coming out now. Everyone's coming out talking about it. And most of the people who are the crony capitalists, fascists, bankers, politicians, all the evil people, they all say they hate it. And of course they do. Because this is like kryptonite to Superman or silver bullet to the werewolf for vampires or something. I don't know. But yeah, so this is massive. See, this is the thing that I wanted to sort of get across is a lot of people think this is sort of like a flash in the pan. This is tulip mania. You hear that every now and then. it's just something that's trendy right now. No, this is the core of the most important thing for human freedom in human history, as far as I know. And I don't know much about human history because they lie about all of it. So I only believe what I see now. If you go deep enough down the rabbit hole, everything's a lie. So this is so massive. And the beautiful thing is, they don't know how to stop it. Whenever someone comes out and says he's Satoshi Nakamoto every now and then, what happens? SWAT teams go and take everything in his house, arrest him immediately. That's what would happen if there was a Bitcoin CEO. Because the government and the people who control the governments and central banks, their only real one form of control is violence and fear. So they don't know anything but that. They're not creative. Some people even question if they're human because of it. But they are just violent criminals. And all they know is if we want to get rid of this, who do we arrest? That's basically what they ask. And then once their 20 agents come back and they go, there's actually no one to arrest. They're like, well, where do we go to shut it off? And it was actually the Guardian newspaper in the UK a year or two ago came out with something that really exposed the government and the central banks. I forget exactly what it was. The UK government, MI6, came in and they started literally stomping on their computers. They were in their office like stomping on them. They might as well have been shooting them. That's all they know how to do. And like people were just sitting there looking at them stomping on their computers going, you never heard about the cloud? Right? They don't understand that, which is great. So they don't know how to stop it. So that's when they talk about stopping it, they talk about two things. They talk about the internet kill switch, which they talk about all the time in Congress. Even Donald Trump, and even the new prime murderer in the UK, Theresa May. Every time they stage a false flag attack or some sort of thing, whatever it is, usually it's all fake. Not always, though. But she comes out and she goes, we have to turn off the internet. And Donald Trump's been saying the same thing. He said it even before this election. It's not an election, it's a selection. He said that before. He said, we got to maybe turn off the internet. And he said that right after, I think it was Las Vegas, which looks incredibly, incredibly staged, or at least done by the government. But he said, we got to turn off the internet. So they're thinking about it. And these people are very, very power hungry and evil. And they will do whatever it takes to stay in power. So they talk about the internet kill switch. They also talk about an EMP attack all the time. An electromagnetic pulse, which would turn off the power in large areas. So they're thinking about that. Even the North Atlantic Terrorist Organization, NATO, said that we're getting ready for an EMP attack to happen inside the US. They even say their little puppet government over there, which is all controlled by the same people, North Korea, they're going to nuke us any day. Well, it's not actually North Korea, it's your own government. That's the biggest enemy of Americans, is the US government. So they're talking about it. So it could happen, absolutely. They could turn off the internet somehow. But the thing that I think is, your average 20-year-old boy in the US today is in his basement, he's about 100 pounds overweight, and he's mostly writing just troll comments on YouTube. But when he's not doing that, he's playing Xbox Live. If they turn that off, he might actually leave his basement and get a little bit angry for the first time in his life and want to do something for the first time in his life. So it's going to be interesting if they try to turn it off now. This thing has gotten out of their control. So this is really what this is all about. This is a monumental battle. And the beautiful thing is, not a shot needs to be fired. This is all a battle of ideas. This is all a battle of, for example, Bitcoin doesn't kill anybody. Bitcoin doesn't use violence against anyone. Whenever they try to shut it down, Bitcoin just keeps working. Bitcoin is the money badger. It's the honey badger of money. It don't care what you do. It just keeps going. And they don't know what to do. Now we have all these other things, Ethereum, smart applications. Steve Wozniak just came out just yesterday or 2 days ago and said he thinks that's really going to be the future of things. All applications decentralized on blockchains, which will mean anything you want to do is not centralized, cannot be stopped by government, cannot be censored or shut down. This is the next stage. Then we have all these other things. We have even people creating blockchains, which they want to decentralize the entire internet itself. So as long as we have power, they won't be able to even censor the internet, which of course censorship is becoming huge. They call it fake news. Anyone who doesn't repeat what the government and the mainstream media, which is just the propaganda arm of the government, if they don't repeat that narrative on something, they get shut down on YouTube, shut down on Facebook, and they call it fake news. Because they always say it's the opposite of what it actually is. So this is a monumental time in human history, and most people don't realize it. And they can't really stop it, as I said, unless they turn off the power. So, they might try to do that, but that's going to be very difficult to do as well. So this is just the beginning, in my opinion. We're now at Bitcoin with a $100 billion valuation. All right. It's the same guy.
All right, that's the out of time, and applause for Jeff. You all right?